workshop at St. Peter's. This week we have one of our second-year undergraduates, Amy Bolster, who's going to be giving us some insights on music by Jacques Devert and also Partbooks in performance, so the difference between the scores that they used in the 16th century and the difference between the scores that they used now in the 21st. So I'll hand over to Amy and off we go.
Yeah, of course. Absolutely. So I brought some handouts, very exciting. But hopefully you're just seeing a little bit of what we're seeing and just a little bit about what you see on the page in front of you. So on one side you have a score, which is the portrait score. And this is the sort of thing that we usually work from today in modern day singing. And on the other side, in landscape, you have a page of a partbook. And this is my partbook, so this is what I'm going to be singing from today. And you can already see there's actually quite a lot of difference going on here. So you've got like a nice little landscape format. It also looks very different on the page. And so what I've been doing in one of my projects for my course this year is looking into partbooks, kind of why they emerged, and how useful they are for us as singers, how different they are to sing from, and what it could kind of teach us today about singing, especially as a group, and responding to what's in front of you as a kind of historical artifact, if you like. So to start with, what actually are partbooks? Why do they evolve? So partbooks are a set of separate parts for each singer. So instead of having everything on one page, you'll have Connor with a tenor partbook, Charlie with an alto partbook, Lee with the second soprano, Helen with the top part. So we all have something completely separate. And it's our job as singers to put them together, which is quite fun, quite challenging. When did they emerge? We think this was around the middle of the 1400s. So the very earliest examples of partbooks we have are in Lichfield Cathedral. And these are very sketchy partbooks, if you like. So they were very much in use for the musicians, probably written by the musicians. And we think they were used for special types of repertoire, which meant that the singers had the freedom to move around. So they weren't all bound to one score and standing around one book at the same time, but they could have their own part and they could sort of walk around the cathedral in processional pieces, or if it was a passion play, for example, you could have one character over here and one character over here. So they sort of afforded a lot more freedom. And they became really, really popular, somewhat overnight really. So at the end of the 1400s, we have a really lovely example, which is in the Jagiellonian Library in Krakow in Poland, I think. And that's similar to what you see in front of you, this sort of landscape format, and it's a very specific type of printing, and that's from 1480, so that sort of marks the popularity of the partbook, really, and they sort of sprung into really popularly used throughout churches, throughout courts, and quite importantly through people's homes as well. So quite a lot of stately homes would have a set of partbooks. You could sort of bring them out after dinner and have a bit of fun, piecing together some music. So that being said, I think we're going to piece together a little bit of music for you today. This piece is called La Mia Ferita by Jacques Devert. This is from his 9th book of musicals, so it's quite late on in his career, and it's from, well, we think the publication is from 1588, so we've had about 100-year use of partbooks at this point. So this is, yeah, it's quite an example of partbooks at their prime, really. quite a late publication. He's taken one of his early madrigals and just flipped it in halfway through. So it's quite fun. We only noticed that when we sang it for the first time. So, what does the experience of singing from Partbooks kind of entail? My question is what we were experiencing as musicians, looking at the Partbook and feeling within our bodies as we were performing, both as individuals and as a group. My first kind of focus point was the eyes. So as you can see in front of you, there's lots to notice. There's only your own part, so it's very, very focused. You're not distracted by anything else going on the page. In one sense, that can be tricky because you don't have the other parts as a reference point. You can't notice, oh, she's on a D or she's on an E, so we need to come in here. It's very much, I have to rely on myself, on my own part. But on the other hand, it's quite aesthetically pleasing. You can really easily see the line and the shape of your own part, which for me is really important because it's expressive. I can understand where my mind is going and kind of what direction it needs to take, really, and also how much breath I need to take as well. If I'm kind of distracted by everything else going on in the score, I might not necessarily recognise, or I need to take quite a big breath here because it's a long phrase, or vice versa if it's a short phrase, I can maybe have a bit more fun with it. So that's the eyes. So we're focusing quite singularly on our own part. I think what this entails for the ears, so our kind of second sense at this point, is that we really have to rely on what we hear around us. So it's really important not to be looking, but to be listening. I don't know whether you noticed, but there are several points where me and Helen were singing together, me and Charlie were singing together, and me and Connor as well. We had a few kind of duets, if you like, and you can only really notice that by listening. So I think that's a really kind of lovely way to share our expressivity by not having to look at it, but to listen for it. And the third sense I picked up on was the body, the breath, the tension, and the sort of patterns we have when we're performing from Partbooks. I already touched a little bit upon breathing, so we all kind of naturally had a sense of where to breathe, where the phrase was heading. So that was really lovely to have that kind of freedom. It's quite natural, intuitive. It's also quite relaxing eventually once you get past the kind of, this is a bit different, I don't know what I'm doing. It's quite freeing for me at least not to have to worry about what other people are doing, about kind of focus on my own experience, enjoy moving about in space, enjoy kind of gesturing to other people a little bit. And I think one of the key things that kind of arose from the discussion of this piece particularly is that we really had to trust each other. We had to kind of build up that sense of relying on, okay, Matt's going to sing his part and I'm going to sing my part, and somehow it's going to work out. And I think that's really special. We don't necessarily have that trust of each other when everything is already there on the page and you're stood in your choir stalls and it's the same melody over and over again. So I think for me the overall takeaway from my research on Partbooks and my kind of interview with these guys when we were putting the piece together is that it's very, very authentic. It's quite a genuine way of feeling and expressing the music without having to look too carefully at the page in front of you. And I think that's quite a rare thing, and I think it's something that definitely could be encouraged much more in our practice of singing today. Thank you very much.
So many things to say following our I'll try and limit them to one before I move on to other people's questions. My kind of first question is obviously to do with the processing which you mentioned, and how we process information differently when we're looking at part as opposed to school. And recently I've been thinking about this quite a lot actually. It's to do with what we need as performers in the 21st century, and how we have a kind of, in Britain especially, a hierarchical structure usually of a director of music who sits at the top, and then the singers who are underneath who do the bidding of the director of music, as it were. So, and this kind of intelligence-based structure whereby somebody informs what other people are to do, because everybody is looking at a school whereby everybody has access to the same information, the people who can make the most of that information tend to be the ones who go the furthest, as it were. And what I mean by that is, if you are able to vertically analyse music very, very well, then you will be further ahead than somebody who can't, because of the fact that you can pick up on errors quicker, basically. And we work on an efficiency system in the UK, whereby we do things very, very quickly. So people who can pick up on those errors are then seen to be the most advanced musicians, effectively. The interesting thing is, when you look at Partbook, is that nobody has any clue, because you don't know who's making errors and who's actually doing it. So it's very much an equalizer in that sense. So I'm just wondering about if that actually changes the atmosphere of when you are looking to rehearse and when you are looking to perform this kind of music and bring it from the ground up. Is there a sense of equality that actually means that people feel more comfortable in that environment when you're actually learning a piece or not?
I mean, I would say so. For me, it's always, I have a tendency to blame myself. I'm always like, oh, I messed up, and actually, it's a very equal process. And we have to be vulnerable with one another and recognise that actually we're all going to make mistakes, because it's different and it's hard. And I think that's a very good thing.
Yeah. I know as a teacher personally, and I'm sure everyone would say much the same thing here, that when you're singing from past, there are times when you also make an error, and it's obviously you're much less likely to do that in a modern score format if you're a very good sight reader. So in a sense, there's an element of humility as well to the very advanced musician, whereby you have to keep a grounding for yourself and actually put yourself on the same plane. Is there anybody who has any questions for Amy following? I think Eric has.
Well, they're called Partbooks, do they appear at the same time as the rise of printing? Are there manuscript versions of these in previous centuries?
Yeah, absolutely. I think that is one of the key things, is that these books were most often printed. The very early versions, if you like, were handwritten by scribes. But as you can imagine, writing out 4, 5, 6 different books is quite a time-consuming process. So, yeah, most of the time, especially the 1500s, it's just full of printed Partbooks missing.
But the notation is a conventional form, and we would go back into the
Yes,
manuscript culture.
absolutely. So what they would do is, this is called movable type print, and if you look really carefully, you can still see little gaps between the lines and the notes. So each note would be separate from a little block, and they would sort of print each block very meticulously, and then pop in the words afterwards.
So it wasn't printed as a single draw on a press.
No, so that came later. We have, especially with scores, they would engrave a big sheet of probably metal, and then ink it and sort of press it flat on the page, so you have a whole page of music. At this point in time, it's just tiny little blocks making it all up. So, yeah, interesting.
I'm curious about the reasons they may have fallen out of favour.
Yes, me too. I'm very curious. I mean, it's one of these areas which actually people haven't looked into so much. We don't particularly know why they were so popular for a while, and then they sort of disappeared again. I think what I'm going to put it down to is a big rise in instrumental music, and a sort of interaction with voice parts and instrumental parts. Suddenly the singers perhaps might have needed to know what's going on around them. Not too sure. Yeah. I don't know if anyone else has
Add
insight
to
to that.
yeah. In the kind of early 17th century, there's a bit of a change whereby you start to see, I think Simone Molinaro was the first printer of Cesare's music in 1615, whereby you can see the entirety of the score. But also there are quite a few manuscripts around that period, the Tribune manuscripts, whereby there's also scores handwritten. And I think it seems to also go hand in hand with the rise in difficulty of music in that sense. So voice reading, for example, can be very, very difficult from Partbooks because you just don't have any context. Obviously, when we are performing 16th century music, if you're very well versed in that and you understand how counterpoint works, then you realise that there's only certain notes that you can really be entering on. So you have a pretty good gauge of what's possible and what's not. When you get to the early 17th century, they kind of throw that in the bin, obviously, and start to go in a different direction. It's very difficult from Partbooks to learn it from the ground up.
Yeah.
So there's an element of that. I think the other thing is, as Amy said, obviously with instruments, it was practice that continued through unbroken, and is still the case, in the sense that the high string quartets will still be done in that way. For whatever reason, vocal music just went on a slightly different path, even in the Baroque, whereby you started to get more kind of concertato style music with instruments and voices. And I don't know if this has also to do with the fact that when you're working with instruments and voices and you want to add more flexibility to the performance, it's actually easier to do so when you can see what somebody else is doing. That's also a help. So I think there are practical reasons for it as well as maybe others.
And when you get a lot more, if you've got a piece with instruments and voices, you've got a lot more rest for the voices, and you don't want a partbook which just has a ton of rest.
Yeah, 78, yeah. There's a lot of it comes down to pragmatism. There's a huge pragmatic element.
So we just spent an hour about it at Selwyn not long ago, where Partbook would have a lot to recommend it because the score is gigantic. No freedom of movement at all if you're carrying around a score that size. I'm curious about about singing as native English speakers, singing these madrigals. How much does your expression depend upon understanding the text and where?
I think if the piece is composed well enough, the musical high points, which you can kind of sense by listening, by singing, it doesn't matter, you can still hear it. If it's a good composer, most of the time those moments align. So strictly speaking, you don't necessarily need to know what the language is saying, but obviously not everything is well composed.
So unrequited love sounds the same as death.
Well, the irony of that is that in early 16th century madrigals, it kind of does. So the earliest form of the madrigal for four voices, the kind of Verdelers and the Festas and these kind of composers, the difference between harmonically between what we would consider difference between sad and happy is not huge. There is a small difference because it's effectively based off the sacred. As it gets further along, I think this probably depends on where you're from. If we were in Italy right now and you were speaking to them about whether we should be understanding the Italian, I think they would have a very different interpretation on that than we might. But as a kind of person who's sung a huge amount of 16th century music, I would say that you can gauge a lot by understanding certain words, for example, and certain, you don't have to understand every single sentiment, because musically most of the time the piece will take you in a certain direction. What I would say is integral is understanding syntax and accents. So understanding how Italian sentence structure works and understanding where the accent should be placed is very, very important. Only really when you start to get towards 1570 and 1580 plus do they really start what we would call actively word painting on individual words. And that's probably the difference between what Tasso calls crude poetry of the kind of Guarini era and the poetry prior, which is about form and structure, whereby it's more important to understand how things work in a long phrase as opposed to understanding how you can make the most instant impression with one word, as it were.
I mean, if that helps to know, translation for this piece goes something like this. My wounded soul pours out from my eyes a river of pain. At the end of the day I cried with indignation. imagination and fear. These are no longer tears of love. The blood of the soul is tears which comes from the wound where life and soul exit. So it's a very sad piece. I don't know whether you can tell.
It's a fascinating project, isn't it? There should be a project whereby we sing things and then the audience is actually invited to say what they believe it's actually about. Because based on what you do, and the same from a performance perspective, it would be fascinating to see how one would. I'm just thinking about certain words, for example, within that text, like lacrime and dolor and pianto and these kind of words, which when you see those words in a context, there's no way, it's not joyous, it's not anything which is going to give you a kind of happy vibe. So you know the general, and in the Renaissance, the difference between melancholy and happiness in that sense, we tend to get very analytical about things nowadays, but actually the mood on the whole is a critical thing as a general vibe. I don't think anybody would be singing that music, or at least I would hope not, thinking that this is a happy piece. If they are, then they are just a bad musician. Pretty simple as that. Yeah.
Thank you.